I'd like to start off my portion of the show by giving you a taste of a little something we call rock and roll. 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 Rockin' and a rollin'. Rock and roll. Rock and roll.
All right, welcome to the It's Only Rock and Roll podcast. I'm Don 𝗙𝗪𝗪, and today we have a very special guest whose name you may or may not be familiar with, but I can almost guarantee you've seen more than just a few of his now iconic rock photographs. From a mustard-smeared face of Sid Vicious eating a hot dog, to Debbie Harry crawling out of an overturned car, to Led Zeppelin poised triumphantly in front of their personalized Boeing 720 jet, and the classic images of John Lennon in front of the Statue of Liberty. Photojournalist Bob GRUEN is considered one of the most revered rock insiders, who for the first time is telling the backstory behind capturing those legendary images in his soon-to-be-released autobiography, Right Place, Right Time, The Life of a Rock and Roll Photographer. And Bob GRUEN will be here shortly to give us a preview. Rock music at its core is every bit as much a visual medium as it is a sonic one. And what the producer does to capture the sound, rock photographers, at least the good ones, are tasked to capture the imagery and ethereal magic of rock and roll. And today's guest is peerless when it comes to catching lightning in a bottle, as his photos of John Lennon, Led Zeppelin, the Sex Pistols, the Ramones, and hundreds of others have gained icon status. And for the first time, he's telling the stories behind those pictures in his upcoming autobiography, Right Place, Right Time, The Life of a Rock and Roll Photographer. Please welcome to the It's Only Rock and Roll podcast, Bob GRUEN. Good morning, Bob.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, it's truly an honor having you on the show today. And I want to get into the history of how you got started. But first, I got to ask you, you've put out photo books before of your work, but never something so personal as an autobiography. What made you decide that this was the right time to do this?
Well, I've been telling stories to people all my life, and for 30 years, people have been saying, you should write a book. So I finally did. It's been fun, reminiscing and adding it all up. There are a lot of pictures in the book, but they illustrate the stories. It's not that the captions illustrate the pictures.
Right.
So it's very different in the sense that it is a book of words that you read.
Well, for you, what came first, your passion for rock and roll or for photography?
Well, I learned photography before there was rock and roll.
Okay.
I learned when I was about 4 or 5 years old. My mom had a darkroom because photography was her hobby. So she used to develop and print her own pictures. And when I was too big to go to sleep early and too little to leave out in the house, she took me in the darkroom with her and taught me how to do it. And so I've been doing that ever since. Rock and roll came about 5 or 6 years later, but changed my life. And I kind of fell into a rock and roll lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
After high school, I tried a couple of colleges, but that didn't really work. So I lived with a rock and roll band. You know, the idea of turn on, tune in, and drop out turned out to be the right path for the rest of my life.
Now, your mom, was she taking a lot of photos? Was it more angle?
No, my mom was an attorney. My mom actually graduated from law school in 1932, one of only 5 women in a class of 200 men.
Wow.
But photography was her hobby, and she enjoyed taking pictures and developing them herself. But mostly family pictures. I mean, she didn't do any art pictures or reporting or journalism or anything like that.
Do you remember the early equipment you had?
Yes, actually. I started getting really interested when I was 5. So for my 8th birthday, I still remember waking up and there was a box next to my pillow, and it was a kit with a Brownie Hawkeye camera and a flash attachment. And that was my first camera. I used that for a couple of years till for my 13th birthday, I got an actual 35 millimeter camera, which was still relatively simple, but advanced in the sense that I could focus it and set some of the speeds and things.
Right.
And then actually, I think when I was about 14, because I started taking pictures when I was 11 and selling them to people in our town, they would have dances and, benefit dinners and things. And I would go there and take pictures of all the people dressed up in their fancy clothes and sell them, with a Polaroid for $5. And people thought I was like kind of young using his dad's camera or something. And I actually went and bought what's called a Crown Graphic. And if you look at all the 1940s and 50s pictures of all the press photographers, they have a big square camera that's about a foot square.
Oh, yeah.
And it takes one frame at a time, a 4x5-inch piece of film. And it's very formal and professional. And I got one of those. And then instead of saying that looks like a kid with his dad's camera, people started saying like, oh, he's awfully young to be a photographer.
Yeah.
Because nobody would carry one of those cameras unless they were actually a photographer. And I've always been taking pictures and trying to get by that way.
And the first few published photos of yours, they weren't of musicians at all.
No, actually, the very first picture that was published was a picture I took of a fire. I was coming home and I saw the firemen running up a building, and I went and took pictures of that and got it published in the local paper. And our high school actually had a printing shop class where we had presses and silk screening and things like that. I really enjoyed that class, and I learned a lot there about how photographs reproduce and printing and so on. We had a after school group called the Printers Devils, and we actually got written up for having so much interest in the print shop. My first cover picture was a picture I took of our class gathered around a press for the print shop magazine. And then actually, when I was 15, 16, when they were running the elections, I remember I used to go to the political picnics, basically, to get a hot dog or a drink. But I took pictures of all the politicians. And one year, I think when I was 16, both the Republican and the Democratic state senator were using my photos for their posters.
Wow.
I'm nonpartisan in that sense. Well, I was back then. I'm not now.
Did I see a photo of Kennedy in there that you took?
I actually have pictures I took off the TV of the Nixon-Kennedy debate. President Kennedy talked at Roosevelt Field out of Long Island, near where I was, where I grew up. And I went out there to see him and got a couple of pictures as he came walking by. And what was unique that I remember is as he came walking by, I was like in the front of a whole crowd of people, and there's people pushing a little bit, and he accidentally stepped on my toe, and he stopped and turned around and said, "Excuse me." Wow. Which I was really impressed, that he was kind of a busy guy.
Yeah.
But he was aware, he was very human about that. And that impressed me. Among everything else that impressed me about him.
Oh, God, yeah. Now, I know in 1965, you traveled to my neck of the woods, Newport, Rhode Island, for the folk festival. You must have been about, 19, 20 years old?
Right. A couple of times.
That infamous particular one you witnessed Dylan, backed up by Mike Bloomfield and Al Cooper. Tell me your memories.
Well, it was really exciting. I mean, the song Subterranean Homesick Blues had come out a little earlier. I think even Like a Rolling Stone might have been out by then. So they could have expected that he was going to play a more electrified set. Muddy Waters and a couple of the other blues players had used the electric guitar, but for some reason, it wasn't just that Dylan played with an electric guitar, but he played with a rock and roll band, and it was a different beat than the slow blues. And since he was revered as the folk icon of the protest movement, when he came out wailing away with a rock and roll band, a lot of people were very upset. A lot of people liked it. And it was the most unique thing because people started booing and people started cheering, and then they started yelling at each other. And it was just kind of chaos. Very weird to see people cheering and booing at the same time. I do remember that Bob Dylan came out with Spanish boots, tight pants, an orange, which was really weird, a very bright orange shirt with a black leather jacket. And he just looked cool. He didn't look like a folk singer, shabby or trying to look like a farmer. He looked like a rock star.
Yeah.
And I think that might have upset people. Just the way he looked was different. It was very much rock and roll.
And yours was one of the only color photos that I've seen of him at Newport.
Yeah, it's interesting. Over the years, I haven't seen any others until just about 2 years ago, 3 years ago. They auctioned the guitar. I think Sotheby's auctioned the guitar that Dylan is playing at Newport. And they managed to find one or two other pictures. I know Jim Marshall was there, and I know David Garr, who both represented Folkways and Sing Out, folk music magazines. And I actually didn't represent anybody. I had kind of talked my way in with a fictitious letter saying I represented an ad agency, which didn't do anything about music, but I managed to get a pass. And actually, my picture wasn't out for a couple of years because I didn't have any clue of who to send it to or where to send a picture. I didn't know any magazines or anything.
Right.
But that's why I've always been surprised that neither David or Jim Marshall's pictures get around very much.
Yeah, yeah.
But my picture seems to be everywhere.
And I know you went to Woodstock, and from what I read, you went for the same reason I would have made the trip if I had been alive at that time, to see The Who.
Yeah, I'm a Who fan. And by that time, anytime The Who played within 100 miles of New York, I was there. I saw him at Forest Hills in the rain. I saw him at Fillmore when the theater caught fire. I was a Who fan. And I remember I was in my studio. I remember where I was sitting at the desk, and I got the Village Voice and opened up, and there was this big ad about 3 days of peace and love and music. And there was all different names on there, like Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin, who was great. And I'd go see Janis. But right in the middle, it said The Who, and I just took out my checkbook, and I wrote out a check, and I bought 4 tickets. Which I still have.
Oh, that's cool.
I collected the tickets. But yeah, we had a great time. I went as a camper. I just gotten married. I went with my wife and a couple of friends. I'm a good camper. I generally bring food and equipment to cook and a tent and sleeping bag. So we were very comfortable at Woodstock, actually. We had a really good time.
How close were you to the action?
Well, we weren't by the stage. That hillside was rather crowded, and after a couple of days, it kind of smelled. At the top of the stage, kind of up towards the right, there was a big woods. with pathways through the woods. And on the other side of that was another field. And that's where we were camping, right next to where the hog farm commune had set up the free food.
Yeah.
Because actually a friend of mine had gone up, I think Tuesday night. The festival started Friday, and we were going to go up Friday morning because I had a job. I couldn't leave too early. My friend went up on Tuesday or something. And anyway, by Thursday, the radio stations were all saying it was too crowded, too many people, the roads are jammed, you can't get there. And my friend called me up and he said, man, you got to get here. This is the coolest place ever. And I said, the radio says it's all crowded. He goes, no, we'll save a space for your tent. And our little group of friends we had back then, you'd have what we call a freak flag. Mm-hmm. Where you just make up some weird kind of flag. I think ours was orange and green. And you put that up on the top. He said, you'll see it. I said, well, the place is a big place. How am I going to find you? He said, well, right next to the place called the Hog Farm, and they have the free food. I said, well, I can find free food. So I did. I found them.
That's great.
Because then I remember the end of the conversation. I said, where are you calling me from? And he said, well, there's a phone nailed to a tree in the woods. And I thought any place sophisticated enough to have a phone nailed to a tree, at least I wasn't totally, secluded. So I went, and we got there, and it was amazing.
Did you bring any camera equipment with you?
I actually, I wasn't working as a photographer yet. I was working in a photo studio, actually, taking pictures of artwork for the studio.
Yeah.
But I wasn't really taking pictures of music or anything like that yet. And I did bring a camera, and about 2/3 of the pictures that I took are portraits of my friends. Kind of headshots inside the tent. So you have like a smiling young guy with a green screen behind him, just the tent wall. I do have actually half a dozen pictures that I took at the festival, and on my website, BOBGRUEN.com. If you go to the icon for featured stories, I have a story of the photos I took. There's a picture of me at Woodstock, looking pretty much the same I do today, sort of.
Yep.
An amazing weekend of freedom and acceptability. And, in this world today where everybody's afraid of everybody, you think back like how beautiful it was that people trusted each other. One vignette that was a strong memory was one afternoon we were sitting up on a hillside behind the stage, which was almost empty. And we're looking at the stage, and in front of the stage, there's 500,000 people. And behind the stage, there's about 30 of us spread out on this other hillside. And we were sitting there listening to music, and there was a pathway, and some kid was like laying there passed out next to the pathway. And a couple of biker types, like really kind of rough-looking dudes, come walking up the path. And they stopped by the kid that was passed out, and one kid kind of tapped his arm and kind of pushed his shoulder a little with his boot. I started thinking, like, why are they bothering this kid? He's just sleeping. And the kid woke up and looked at me. He said, hey, man, you better turn over. You're getting sunburned. Huh? And the fact that these rough dudes, took the time to help out somebody like that they didn't have to, really something that I just remember, as a real example of what was going on there.
Tell me how a night out to see Ike and Tina Turner review opening for Sam and Dave changed your life.
Oh, absolutely. Actually, one of the people who came to Woodstock with us, our friend Judy Rosen, knew about Ike and Tina, and she said we had to see them, that they were the most amazing act, and we took her up on it. We went to see them. I remember they opened for Sam and Dave. Ike and Tina was so amazing. I was at the Rolling Stones show several years earlier where they opened for the Stones, but we were in this big arena, and we were up on the nosebleed seats. Yeah. And whatever was going down on the stage wasn't really, something you could be too aware of. But at the Felt Forum for the Sam and Dave show, Tina was just the most spectacular, exciting, thrilling show I had ever seen. And I watched her dance off the stage. And at the end of the show, there was a strobe light flashing. And you would just see all these different, how a strobe freezes the action.
Yeah.
And you would just see Tina frozen in all these different wild poses as she was dancing off the stage. And I remember I was so stunned. I just kept staring at the curtain where Tina had disappeared behind it. And Sam and Dave kind of came up and did an act. And I just kept staring at the curtain thinking about Tina. They played a few shows around New York. So a couple of days later, they played at a place called the 𝗀𝗃𝗃𝗃 Room. It's not something I can make up. The 𝗀𝗃𝗃𝗃 Room in Queens. And I went out there. It was a funky little nightclub, kind of bar, actually, with a linoleum floor in the basement. And I think the stage was about 1 foot high, a very funky little club. And they crammed the whole band with 4 horns and everybody onto the stage. And it was amazing. And that night I brought my camera and I started taking pictures. And that was actually probably the beginning of my career because I got some really good shots that night. And towards the end of the show, as the strobe light started flashing, I only had a few frames left in the camera. And I thought I might as well use them up and see what would happen if I took a 1-second picture and tried to capture several of the flashes in one picture. And I took about 5 shots and 4 of them are useless. And one of them is probably one of the best pictures I've ever taken in my life because it just captures 5 images of Tina, one after another, just showing the intensity and the excitement that is Tina Turner. And then the miracle happens a couple of days later. They played another show in New Jersey, and I brought the pictures with me. I had taken a few good ones that night, and I brought them with me to show my friends. And as we were walking out of the theater, my friend saw Ike Turner walking from one dressing room to another. And she literally pushed me in front of Ike and said, "Show Ike the pictures." And he stopped and he said, "What pictures?" And I showed him, and he goes, "These are good pictures. I got to show these to Tina." And he took me in the dressing room. Tina liked the pictures, and he told me to meet him in New York a couple of days later. And he started introducing me to people in the music business. And that was literally the real start of my career. I had been dabbling a little bit. The band that I lived with had gotten a deal. By the time they got a deal, they were called the Glitter House. And they actually met Bob GRUEN, the famous producer of the Four Seasons in Frankie Valley. And Bob GRUEN liked him. And actually, the Glitter House can be heard on the internet as the vocal for the soundtrack for the Barbarella movie.
Oh, okay.
But then after that, Bob GRUEN did an album for the Glitter House. I was just beginning to meet one or two people, but after I met Ike and he introduced me to a publicist, and that guy took me to a party, and I met 5 or 10 more people, and it just started snowballing. From there on, every time I went somewhere, I'd meet more people, and they'd ask me to take more pictures, and it just went on for the rest of my life.
Do you remember what your first big, was it an assignment, or were you always just freelancing and shopping the photos around?
Well, I think the first job that I got, I do remember Atlantic Records hired me to take pictures of Tommy James and the Shondells, who were opening at a rally for Hubert Humphrey in a parking lot in Yonkers in the rain. An auspicious beginning. But what I do remember actually was that I talked to the band and got to know them and drove home. They gave me a ride home. And that would be the kind of pattern for the rest of my life, that I would make friends with the people I worked with. Not everybody, but quite a few of the people I worked with, I ended up friends with, because I always kind of shared an artistic, the lifestyle of musicians and artists, meaning I'm up at night all the time.
Yeah.
But, right from the beginning, it's just seemed to work out.
From the artists that I've heard talk about you and why they love you and your work so much is that you don't make it about yourself. You're there kind of in the background. I think they appreciate that you're not like up in their face or...
Yeah, I know. I mean, some photographers have a vision and they want to create something and they use the people as their models to create their idea. But I don't do that. I like people to be natural. I don't give very much direction at all. I don't say, "Hey, give me more leg, baby."
Yeah.
I kind of keep quiet actually and have a conversation with people and just let them be natural. Because I feel that if I tell them turn this way or lift your shoulder, they're going to be trying to do what I'm thinking. And I'd rather take a picture of them being them and just getting a picture of what they're thinking.
Right.
So I don't give very much direction. I have patience instead.
You were an early adopter of the nascent home videotape market. People don't talk about that enough, but that was amazing that you were able to get videotape of some amazing artists.
Well, in this day and age, when everybody's got a color stereo camera in high def in their pocket, it's hard to remember that 1968, actually, the Democratic Convention was the first time that there was a portable video machine developed for the convention so that the reporters could go down on the floor and record things on a battery-operated videotape machine. It was an amazing development, improvement in video technique. And the first consumer model, the Sony Portapak, was released in 1970. And I was very excited about it. And I talked my dad into buying me one, even though it was very expensive at the time, almost $2,000, I think. But then I just started making tapes of lots of bands, and people just enjoyed watching them. I went to a place called Kenny's Castaways that had a real variety. They had everybody from Willie Dixon to Yoko Ono to Tracy Nelson, Larry Coryell.
I've actually played there
you name
in
it,
my
that
band.
Club had everybody. Oh, Kenny's?
Yeah.
Really?
Yep.
The one on Bleecker Street or uptown?
Bleecker Street, 1992.
Oh, in the 90s. He moved downtown to Bleecker Street. Originally, when I was doing it in the 70s, he had a place on 84th Street, all the way uptown.
Oh.
But Pat Kenny was a wonderful guy. He let me tape everything that happened there. The New York Dolls played there pretty often. And I just started making videotapes. And then, I think it was around 1972, because at first the only place you could show it was on the videotape machine. But the thing was, you didn't have to get film, you didn't have to get a projector, you didn't have to arrange for a screening room. You could just take the videotape machine that you record on and plug it into any television set in a dressing room or in a hotel room or at home and play it back on a TV. So it was super convenient. And then around 1972, Manhattan Cable started. It's funny, people don't know that cable TV didn't always exist.
Right.
But cable TV started, and when they did, the government put in restrictions that if they were going to have all these channels to offer to people, they had to have 2 channels that were open to the public for public broadcasting, for public content. And in fact, since it was public free speech and it was not over the FCC airwaves, it didn't have to be censored at all. You could put whatever you wanted. So I ended up putting on a rock and roll show. And every week I would go to some different clubs and I would edit together a half hour or an hour, and had shows of Patti Smith and the New York Dolls and Blondie and Robert Gordon and Jane County. And we put on all kinds of shows. And it was kind of interesting. At the first couple of years, we didn't have cable in my building. Most people didn't really have the cable at the beginning. It took a long time before they wired up the whole city, particularly because it was expensive. I mean, expensive. Nowadays it's $200 or something. Back then, $25 for the cable was a lot of money. And so it took a while to wire it in. I remember after a couple of years, at one point around 75, I think I called up the company to see if they're ever going to get around to wiring our building. And the guy said, "Well, I don't think so," because our building was all artists, and we were in the edge of a not an expensive neighborhood. And then I told him, I said, "Well, I make the TV show, the rock and roll show, Bob Gruen's Rock and Roll." And the guy goes, "Oh, you do that show? I love that show. Let me see what I can do." And within a week, we had cable in the building.
Nice.
So he said, "You mean you can't even see your own show?" I said, "No." And the guy wired me up.
That's great.
So, I mean, it wired the whole building up. I didn't get a lot of feedback from the show until around 76, when more and more people started buying cassette. They had like 3/4-inch cassette machines at home. I didn't want people recording my tapes. So I stopped running the show. And as soon as I stopped running it, all kinds of people were making comments. "What happened to your show? I used to watch it all the time." I was kind of surprised because I didn't know that so many people were watching it. We've edited some of the videos together because back then, because I was doing the videos, first when I got with Ike and Tina, they loved having the videotape because I could tape a show and then we'd go right into the dressing room or in the hotel after the show and I could show it back. And Tina could go over the show with the Ikettes, like literally 10 minutes after the show while everything was still fresh and, go over, "Oh, look, you're turning left instead of right," and, fix the details.
Yeah.
And the New York Dolls just loved seeing themselves on TV. I actually have DVDs that are available online. You can buy Ike and Tina Turner on the Road, 1971-72.
Sure.
It's the only footage of Ike and Tina being themselves on and off stage. Ike in the studio, Tina at home actually cooking for her kids. And the other one is the New York Dolls. There's two of them. There's the New York Dolls All Dolled Up and another one called Looking Fine on Television.
Well, I'll tell you, the videotapes that I've seen that you made that amazed me was of John Lennon. You were in the studio with him in August of 1980 doing some color video, which has made its way onto YouTube, which I'm sure you're not thrilled about.
That was the first time I borrowed, actually, the owner of Max's Kansas City had a VHS camera that was the first really compact with a VHS cassette fit in the camera. I mean, the machine I was using, the Sony Portaback, was a reel-to-reel 40-pound box that you carried on your shoulder along with a 10-pound battery. And the camera itself was about another 10 pounds connected on a wire. But in 1980, we had this VHS camera that had the cassette in the camera. And I borrowed it to show John how it worked. He was thinking of getting one. So that's only a few minutes of footage in the studio. I was just showing him, A, that it worked. There was such a compact machine. And B, the amazing thing that it worked more in the dark. The early cameras didn't really work in the dark at all.
But that is among the only footage period of him in that time period.
I haven't seen it in years.
I'll send you a copy.
Okay.
But since I brought him up, the question you've probably been asked a million times, how did you start working with John and Yoko?
Through an interview, basically. I actually met them for the very first time at the Apollo Theater. There was a benefit concert for the victims of the riot at the Attica prison. And Aretha Franklin was going to be there. And I went there to see Aretha. And when I walked in, I heard the announcer say John Lennon and Yoko Ono. And I felt like I was hit by lightning. I was finally in the same room. They had been in New York for about 4 or 5 months. And it was reported in the newspaper that they were riding bikes in Greenwich Village. And in fact, they had moved into a townhouse literally a half a block from my house in Greenwich Village. But I'd never seen them. Everybody had reported they saw him walking down the street or whatever. And then at the Apollo Theater, there they were. After the show, they were waiting for their car backstage, and a few people were taking, little snapshots, what we call selfies nowadays. Back then, they little Instamatic cameras.
Yeah.
And I took a couple of pictures. And at one point, John just happened to say, people are always taking our picture like this, and we never see them. What happens to these pictures? And I said, well, I live around the corner from you. I'll show you my pictures. And he said, you live around the corner? I said, yeah. He said, well, slip them under the door then. And so I went by a couple of days later with some prints. I didn't quite slip it under the door. I did ring the bell. And much to my surprise, Jerry Rubin answered the door. I guess he was visiting and did him a favor by answering the door. But I remember he asked if they were expecting me. And I said, no, I just came by to give them something. And I gave him the envelope and I left. And later, after we did get to know each other, Yoko said that impressed them because nobody just gave them something. Everybody wanted something from John and Yoko. And I was the only person who came by and just said, here's something for you. So they remembered that, like, who was that guy, But then in the spring, I think around March, there was a magazine called After Dark that was doing an article, actually not on John and Yoko, but on the Elephants Memory Band. And John and Yoko were using the Elephants as a backup group to record an album. And so the interviewer was going to interview John and Yoko, and he asked me if I would come and take pictures. And we actually met them in a hotel where they were doing the interviews, and I took some good pictures there. And then after the interview, since the story was about the elephant's memory, and I knew that John and Yoko were going to meet the elephants that night, they were going to record them, I asked if I could come along. And they said yes, and I ended up spending the night in the studio with them and getting a whole bunch of pictures. A couple weeks later, they contacted me, and they wanted to use one of the pictures in their album cover. It was sometime in New York City. I have a nice picture of John and Yoko and the whole band together. And it was then that actually the drummer, Rick Frank, brought me to John and Yoko's house, and I showed them the pictures I had taken, and then I showed them other pictures that I had, and we had a conversation, and we liked each other. And at the end of the conversation, I remember Yoko telling me that they always wanted to stay in touch with me, and I'm still in touch with Yoko today.
That's really cool. Did you travel to LA with John when they split? Did you ever go out there with him?
No.
Never?
That's why maybe I'm still alive today.
Yeah,
a couple
right.
of people who didn't make it.
Right.
No, the Lost Weekend was lost, and I actually, there were times when I'd read about it in the newspaper, or I'd hear from friends that he was out of control, and sometimes I wondered if he'd ever get back to New York, or if he'd keep going and end up relaxing in Hawaii or something.
Yeah.
When he came back to New York, actually, I saw him just after he came back. He was recording with Harry Nilsson, and he asked me to come down to the studio. And then a month or so later, he asked me if I would take pictures for the Walls and Bridges album cover, where we did a whole series of pictures of John's face. And he had wanted me to do it in a very simple, quick way. He didn't want to go to a studio, and he didn't want to. It was just a whole series of pictures, just close up of his face. So I went to his house. We had a penthouse. He still hadn't gone back with Yoko yet. He had a penthouse apartment with a little roof, so we went out on the roof and we took the pictures of his face. And then I suggested we take some more pictures so he'd have pictures for publicity. And we started taking a couple, and the skyline was all around us. And I had given him that New York City T-shirt a year earlier. It was something that guys just sold on the sidewalk on a blanket in Times Square. It wasn't from a store. But whenever I'd see the guys, I really liked the graphic of it. So I bought a couple for myself. One night I bought one for John. And when we were up on the roof, I said, "Do you still have that shirt I gave you?" And I know he must have liked it because he had been in L.A. and back for a year, and he knew where the shirt was. And he went right inside and got it, came out and put it on. We had no idea that picture was going to become so well known.
Right.
But I think there's a casualness to it and an intimacy because we were, so friendly, and he looks like he's open and ready to have a conversation. And so a lot of people really like that picture.
A year before John was murdered, I was about 8 years old, and I bought the Anthony Fawcett book, One Day at a Time. And it was probably the first time I ever saw your name in a credit. And right on the cover, there's that iconic John Lennon at the Statue of Liberty.
I think that was one of the first Lennon books I was involved in.
Oh, was it? Yeah. But there he is with the Statue of Liberty. Can you go into that?
Well, it was in the fall of '74 after we'd taken the New York City pictures. The government was trying to throw John out of the country because the Nixon administration was afraid that he was going to gather support against Nixon. So they started this hokey case about how he was arrested for having a couple of joints, which actually, eventually the policeman that arrested him was arrested for planting marijuana with several rock stars. But anyway, the case was important at the time. They were trying to deport John Lennon, and I felt that, the Statue of Liberty is a symbol of welcome, and we're supposed to be welcoming great artists like John Lennon. So I suggested to him that we could take a picture at the statue. I was very happy that he agreed with me that it would be a great symbol, and we went out there. The actual doing it was pretty simple. I felt that he was a tourist from England. I didn't need to get a permit from anybody to go and take a picture. Like every day, there's tourists taking pictures of themselves out there. So we just took the ferry out there. We walked around to the front. The hard part is trying to line up a person who's about 6 feet with a statue that's 305 feet.
Right.
And to try to get the whole thing in perspective, because it's on an island and there's only so far you can go back, or you fall in the water.
Right.
So I do remember trying to juggle it around because I work very simply. It's not like I went out there a week in advance with 4 assistants and tried to measure everything and use 6 lenses. I just took my camera bag and went with John and made it work. That's how I do things.
And it did work.
But I was very proud of that picture. It wasn't used very much. Most of the magazines didn't want to be involved in John's political case. But after John passed away in the 80s, the picture took on a much larger meaning.
Right.
Because it really relates to personal freedom and liberty. And I think that John is a symbol of personal freedom, like the statue.
Absolutely. Interesting things about you that always intrigued me is that you had this great affinity for John Lennon and for classic rock artists. But you were also at the cutting edge of what was happening in New York in the 70s with the bands that were playing Max's Kansas City and CBGB's. Tell me how important being in those places was to your career.
Well, it was my life. I wasn't there so much as a reporter. I was there because it was my lifestyle. People say, how do you become unobtrusive in a situation? I said, by becoming part of it. a lot of my assignments were not assignments in a sense. Like I didn't go to Max's because an editor told me to take a picture of a band.
Right.
I had the opportunity I was working with Lisa Robinson and Lenny Kaye and Richard Robinson on a magazine called Rock Scene. And Rock Scene magazine covered the whole scene. So it wasn't that you would just interview a singer about, what he likes to have for breakfast or what hotels he likes and then put one picture of a guy with a microphone. It was mostly almost like a comic book because it was mostly photographs and we had lots of pictures of the whole scene. So if I was with a band, I could have pictures of the band on the bus, relaxing, going into a dressing room, doing a sound check. I'd have pictures of the managers and the road managers, the promoters. Everybody was worth being in Rock Scene. So I just always had my camera and I always had an excuse to take pictures of anything I liked because it would be in Rock Scene. And so sometimes I remember one time there was a group called the B Girls, and I showed up at a club with Johnny Thunders, and the B Girls were there, and I said, "Oh, let me get a picture of Johnny Thunders meets the B Girls," and that was a Rock Scene moment.
Yeah.
And we would do that every day. We'd put people together and call it a Rock Scene moment.
Yeah.
It's all online now. There's actually a website called Rock Scene Stir, like scene STER, where you can see all the Rock Scene magazines. And it's the history of the 70s in rock and roll. Because, yes, we covered everything. We covered Led Zeppelin and John and Yoko, but also we had the first pictures of the Sex Pistols and the Clash. I think that's some of the earliest. It was Lisa Robinson told me to see Debbie Harry before Blondie when she was in a band called the Stilettos. I remember Lisa saying, "This girl's so beautiful, she's going to be a star." And I walked in the room the first time I saw her, I knew Lisa was right. It's very hard to take a bad picture of Debbie Harry because she just always looks good. But it was my lifestyle. Actually, it was funny that after meeting John and Yoko in the Elephant's Memory, John went and produced an album for the Elephant's Memory. And they asked me to do the album cover. And that's when I met the managers of the Elephants. And when I was at their office, one of the guys who worked in the office, Tony Machine, said, "Oh, you should come and see this other band that we managed. They're called the New York Dolls." And that's actually how I found out about the New York Dolls. A lot of people downtown were already going to the Dolls for a few months at the Mercer Art Center. I hadn't heard about them yet until I brought the Elephants pictures by. And then I went to see the Dolls, and I was completely blown away. It was like walking into Fellini's Satyricon.
Right. Yeah.
It was just such chaos and such fun. Everything just going crazy. And then I got to know them and work with them. And they liked me and they liked my pictures and they liked my videotapes. They loved seeing themselves on TV. And one thing led to another. And, I'm still in touch with Sylvain and some of the band today.
They were way ahead of their time. I don't think America was ready for them in 73. Salvador Dali, Alice Cooper, and a chocolatey Eclair. What do those things have in common?
Well, Salvador Dali was making the world's first moving hologram, where the people in the hologram actually moved. And he wanted to use Alice Cooper because he felt that Alice Cooper, as a rock star, was a surrealist, similar to Salvador Dali's surrealism. They asked me to come by to take some pictures. I remember it was kind of an odd day. We were in a loft. At one point, the elevator door opened and a little man in a bowler hat walked out with an attaché case and a beautiful girl. And behind him, there was a large thug with a machine gun. The guy with the machine gun stayed by the elevator and nobody went in or out until the guy in the bowler hat brought the attaché case over to the table. He opened it up and took out a pillow and he took out $20,000 worth of Harry Winston diamonds and a tiara and a necklace and put them on the pillow. And the beautiful girl brought them over and presented them to Dali. And Dali placed them around Alice's neck and his head the way he wanted them to use. He said he had real jewelry because he wanted it to really sparkle in the hologram. And it does, actually. The hologram exists and it's at the Salvador Dali Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida, and in Spain. I can't pronounce the Spanish town, but the Dali Museum in Spain has the other hologram. And they actually sell a postcard of my picture of Alice and Dali. The chocolate eclair is because Dali is holding an object that he called the brain of the pop star that has a chocolate eclair in the middle and ants running across it to get to it. And that was placed behind Alice's head. If anybody listening to this has any idea where that brain of the pop star is, Alice is willing to pay a really good amount of money for it.
I heard that. It's like the holy grail of rock and roll.
Right? Alice has been putting out words. Yeah, where's my head? Where's my brain of the pop star? I'm
going to ask you one of those lame talk show questions.
Which one?
What was the worst experience you ever had?
Well, there's a few hard times, the worst experience, it's hard to list, because, things get tough, but I kind of like a challenge. I remember when I was taking pictures of Alice in Toronto and there was a blizzard and we ran out of film and I had to walk like a mile across a shopping center parking lot, literally 3 feet of snow, just kind of pushing my way through the snow to get to a mall to get film. That was difficult. But that's just normal. Like when you accomplish something like that, you always feel better. Like the harder it is, the better I feel when I've done it. So I don't really think about that was a terrible day kind of thing. Like it was a terrible day. Accomplishing it was a great achievement.
Any artists that were just a pain in the ass to work with?
There's a few, but I won't give them the publicity.
Mm.
Of mentioning their name.
No, but can you tell the story without mentioning them or no?
There's only one or two that I didn't get along with, but yeah, fuck them.
Yeah, here you go.
Am I allowed to say that? You want to edit that out?
Yeah, don't fucking swear on my show, Bob.
Oh, okay.
Besides the Lennon stuff, what's the one you're most proud of?
Well, the Tina Turner picture. Also, there's a picture of Chuck Berry where he looks like he's kissing his guitar. That's very powerful, but very simple.
Yeah.
And it just sums up the power of rock and roll and its simplicity. There's a live picture of the Clash, which really captures the power and the glory that is the Clash.
Anything now inspiring you as a photographer?
Well, not this week because nobody's going anywhere.
No, but I mean,
But yeah, this year I was actually looking forward to seeing Green Day on their tour. Done a lot of work with Green Day for the last 25 years. A year ago, last September, I published a book with Abrams on Green Day that Billy Joe and the band all contributed comments and captions. And Billy Joe actually hand wrote a foreword for the book. And he came up with a graffiti artist who put little drawings throughout the book. It's a really fun 25 years of Green Day. And they were going to carry it on their tour, which was supposed to start last February in Singapore and go around the world and end up here in America in August and September. And of course, it just, cascaded one leg of the tour after another until the entire thing was canceled. And now it's postponed for next year, and we'll see what happens.
Anybody that you always wanted to shoot and never did?
Yes, Otis Redding. I was a big fan of Otis Redding, and I always wanted to meet him. He passed away before I had the chance. I actually met Jimi Hendrix once for a minute on a sidewalk. I showed him my Tina Turner picture, and he said it was a great shot. And I said, I'd like to take pictures of you. And he said, we'll meet again, but then we never did. The book will be out October 20. Unfortunately, I'm not having a big party, but we're having a virtual party, and we'll see what we can do. It's 400 pages. I think a little over 400 pages. So there's a lot to read, a lot of stories. So far, the people that have read it like it, besides my editor and my wife. But for instance, Publishers Weekly, which is quite impressive, they gave me a star. They only give one or nothing. They gave me a star, and they called it a spectacular memoir and a must-read. I think those are good phrases to use.
And that's right place, right time, the life of a rock and roll photographer.
Well, thanks.